Wallace is the Vice President of Artistic Affairs and the Director of Photography and New Media at Anderson Ranch Art Center. And we're so delighted that she's here with us tonight to talk a little bit about her work and her own creative practice. She received her M.F.A. from the University of Colorado at Boulder. She was previously an assistant professor at Lake Forest College and Willamette University. Her film, Rochell and Brian, a documentary about teenage pregnancy, premiered at the New York International Independent Film Festival. She exhibits nationally and internationally with numerous shows throughout the Americas, Europe, China, and the Middle East. And tonight, we're going to get to hear about some of that and how your creative practice also informs your professional work. So Andrea, thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you. And I just want to thank you and the LACP for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here.
We're delighted. So let's just jump right into it. And let's begin with the hardball. I'm curious to hear your thoughts and your impression from the day-to-day work that you have with photographers and visual storytellers at the Anderson Ranch and beyond. Mm-hmm. You know, looking at the cultural landscape and the contemporary landscape at large, what would you say, or how would you characterize the biggest challenge that photographers face today?
Well, I mean, I think there's a couple of things. I think one is just the landscape of the multitude of images that are being made every day and that we're seeing every day, and the dissemination of images and that kind of language that people are, we're just bombarded with images. And there's a great thing about that, because photography's become much more democratic. Mm-hmm. In terms of everyone is making images and sharing images and communicating through images. And then I think the challenge for the medium, for all of lens-based media, it really is probably similar to what it's always been, but maybe more so, and that is content. Mm-hmm. and having real content and communicating visually that way. So I think that's one thing that's a challenge right now, is this landscape of just the internet and the multitude of images. But I also think there's opportunities there as well.
Yeah, tell me about that. What sort of opportunities do you identify?
Well, I mean, I think I see more artists being able to get their work out in a way that maybe they weren't able to in the past, when, it was harder to get an audience for your work. You had to, get a gallery or get into shows or exhibitions. And now I think with Instagram and other kinds of ways, people can really share their work and their stories to a much wider, broader audience without necessarily having to move in the contemporary gallery curator.
Yeah. So there might be more less traditional means of reaching new audiences.
Yeah.
You're just joining us tonight. We're in conversation with Andrea Jenkins Wallace from the Anderson Ranch Art Center. If you have a question for Andrea, please feel free to drop it in the Q&A, and we will address it during our conversation. So Andrea, let me ask you this then. Given what we're saying about Instagram and the outreach and all that, do you feel like the way that you encounter new works by photographers had also changed?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that, obviously I'm always looking. So I'm always, programming for Anderson Ranch. And so we're always inviting artists to come in, whether it's like as visiting artists or critics or residents, or obviously educators for the workshop program. So I'm constantly on the lookout for new work and new voices, diverse voices in photography. And so a lot of times I am finding it, through Instagram and other things, which is different than the way I would have been looking for work or looking for artists, 10 years ago, 20 years ago.
Yeah. And I see there's already a question in the Q&A, which is interesting, a question that I also wanted to bring up, which is, if we're talking about the contemporary landscape, it seems like the main conversation that we're having over the past year or so is around AI
Yeah.
If we would have been having this conversation 6 months ago, we would probably be talking about NFTs now, right?
Right. And now AI is definitely something that is something to consider. And I think a lot of people have a lot of mixed feelings about AI and the kind of work that can be created like that isn't necessarily related to one's craft or even actual vision.
Yeah.
These images come together.
Yeah. Are you ready for the day when you're going to get submitted a work by an artist who's later on going to tell you, well, sorry, that was an AI image. I never took it by myself.
Well, I mean, that's something to think about. And I mean, I think less for me to worry about it, but certainly in the art world and in the journalism world, I think there's a lot more kind of problematic scenarios that will arise because of it, and already have. But I think we're just beginning to see that.
Absolutely. When I work with my students that are emerging artists who think about photographic practice, I always try to remind them that since that's the nerdy photo historian in me, and then they're like, but since the early days of photography, there always seemed to be some sort of a new technology that compromises the assumption that the photograph
is truth.
That the photograph relates to the real. And it seems like over the past year or so, we're constantly reminded of the fact that photography, its history and its presence could be predicated on manipulation rather than the truth.
Well, and it has in many ways, even if you think about the photographic print or, taking a negative and enhancing the print. But I mean, I think you can take that into with the invention of Photoshop and digital but then I think that the AI and other things like that can really start to speak about misinformation and what is real and what is not real. It brings that into conversation in a much sharper focus, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I'll be curious to see what will be the next thing that we'll talk about. Really, like 6 months ago, we were all concerned about, not concerned, but we were all curious about NFTs and how that will influence photographers. It seemed like we finally have a way to guarantee copyright pay for photographers. And now it seems like the conversation has shifted again toward the technology itself. So it'll be curious to see what will be the next step of that. So I'm
and what implications this will have on the field and
exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And how this conversation will also take place in a few months from now. And I'm wondering if that had already started also finding its way into your work at the Anderson Ranch. Is that something that you all are also thinking about? And if so, then how?
Can you just explain that question? So finding this conversation coming into our work at the ranch?
Yeah, in terms of the technology and all those rapid shifts, do you address that? Do you find the need to think about that, or you're just kind of waiting to see what will happen?
Well, I mean, I think in terms of AI, things like that, we're definitely just sort of watching to see what happens. But I mean, in terms of other kinds of technologies, not specific to photography, but in terms of other kinds of technologies, we're always embracing technology as a tool for artists to use to further their vision.
So I'm curious to hear what drove you to pursue working with photographers at the Anderson Ranch? How did you find yourself doing the work that you pursue today?
Well, I mean, I think I went to school to undergraduate for a communications degree in photography and studied photography in undergraduate, and then worked a little bit as a photojournalist for a newspaper for a few years, and then decided to go back to school to pursue a graduate degree in photography and visual storytelling. So I initially was an academic and was teaching at a couple of universities around the country. And then, I had a baby and got divorced and became a single mother and decided I needed a new kind of place to land. And I came to the ranch thinking I would be here for a couple of years and go back into an academic appointment. And 15 years later, I'm still here. And it's been a really wonderful journey. And it's a really rich environment, like a place like Anderson Ranch, to be able to meet so many amazing artists and kind of create curriculum and create programming around them. Not, photography is one thing, but, painters and sculptors and so many artists now are using, a really mixed media kind of approach. So it's been a really great place, and I'm still here.
And I'm curious to hear more about how your work as an artist also drives the work that you do at the Anderson Ranch. So maybe a way into that could be to look at some of your projects, and maybe you could talk a little bit about how is your work as an artist, how is that influenced or informed by your organizational role?
Absolutely. Should I share my screen?
Yes, please do.
I would say that, I came to photography, I think, the way so many of us have, through the family album. And this is a picture of my mother when she was a baby. And I grew up with my mother and my grandmother. And I grew up, because I was growing up in my grandmother's house, I was growing up with these albums, these black and white albums of my mother and her siblings when they were young. And so these are the kind of photographs that I was looking at, the kind of images that were definitely influencing me. And portraiture, this is my grandmother. And so I was definitely thinking about photography, thinking about these people that I knew as grandparents, looking at them as younger people, looking at my mother as a child, trying to sort of make that connection between time and space that photography allows us to do. And so I would say that this is what really influenced me early on, is looking at all of these family photographs, kind of the vernacular, the family album, these kinds of photographs. But also I think that the kind of the way they were framed, the positions definitely influenced me as I look back now to the kind of images that I make, and the kinds of formal kind of posing of people. I'm started to really become interested just in photography's way of superseding memory, of holding that moment true, quote unquote, for all time, pulling it out from supersession of memory and holding it out as something to be looked at and revered. So I'll just talk a little bit about kind of my early photography. And if you look at these kinds of images, these are the same images that I was looking at in my family album. It's the same kinds of way I started to pose people. And I'm from New England and north of Boston. And when I came to Colorado to graduate school, I started a documentary on ranching, a ranching community. I still am very interested in portraits. I'm interested in stories, learning about other people. And I think in my role at the ranch, it sort of mirrors that, because I'm constantly meeting new artists, meeting students, meeting faculty. And I'm interested in people's stories and where they come from and how they came to be, interested in the arts or interested in photography. But this is a series I did on a ranching community in Colorado. It's called Crumbling, Colorado. I started photographing ranchers, kind of had this 4x5 camera, and I had this romantic vision of the big open West, and I was placing people in the landscape because it was their connection to the landscape that was keeping them in this way of life. Many of them were 4th, 5th generations on this land. This is at the end of the 20th century when, people even more so now, but people could make more money by selling their land than they could by running cattle. But they wanted to preserve this way of life for their children and their grandchildren. So I spent a few years in Crumbling making these portraits. This is a young girl named Mary. This is Clovis and Chauncey. They're named after their dad's favorite rodeos. And so, when I think about the kind of photographs that I make and the history of photography and the kind of photographs that I was influenced by, aside from my family album, but those early, Dorothea Lange, those sort of Farm Security Administration photographs, those just real portraitists. I think I was, moving in that vein when I was making these kinds of images.
It's really interesting that you're looking at photography and you're looking at family albums and looking at these analog technologies that do not necessarily are considered a part of the future of photography. And at the same time, you're looking at a form of intense labor that is also slowly disappearing. And what unites both of those interests is your interest in the space of the family and legacy and what comes next.
Yeah, and legacy, and sort of trying to preserve and document the here, the now. This is Dan and Mary. And, these were done, at the late 90s. These are the Baumgartners. Some of these ranchers, not long after I did this project, sold and moved to Wyoming or other places because they couldn't afford the water rights that were on their property. Many of the ranchers were leasing back water from the Denver Water Board in order to continue ranching, and it became so expensive that many of them sold. And because there's no water rights, they sold to developers to make these little ranchettes, which are like weekend getaways for people on the Front Range. So the landscape is changing too, because these ranches are getting bought up and being developed. So this is the project that I was working on for about 5 years. This is Jovan. And I really had a real connection to many of these ranchers. This is Jim. And then I met a teenage couple who had a baby, and I started to work in film and to try to tell more of the story of the small ranching towns, teenage pregnancy, secrets within the families, secrets within the community. And so these are some stills from the film that I made about teenage pregnancy.
What made you turn to film within that?
I think for a long time I was working in these still photographs, and I felt like when I started to kind of meet this one specific couple, I felt like there's so much more to the story, in contemporary meaning around family secrets, teenage pregnancy, all of these other sort of, modern issues that were happening in this ranching community that I could not tell using a still photograph alone. And I wanted them to be able to tell their story in their own words. And that's why I moved to film.
And how did they respond to the film? How did they respond to the documentation?
They were really, really wonderful in using the film. And I made the film in 1998. And then I got a grant to go back 5 years later and do a follow-up film. So I made Rochell and Brian and then Rochell and Brian +5. And it was really a story told from the perspective of the mother and daughter about the pregnancy, about, sort of the men in the families and how involved or not involved they were, family secrets around the pregnancy, family secrets around who the father was. It was really they were very vulnerable and very open with me, and I really I think that's something that some of the stories that I was finding in making these kind of documentaries are stories that are within my own family, whether it's pregnancy or secrets, but I was sort of telling those stories through the stories of other people. So I'm just going to keep going because I know
go ahead. Yes, please do.
Time. But then, so I was been working on documentaries for many years, and then I had my own child, and then I was 40 plus. This is when blogs were in fashion. So, and I had a baby, and I became a single mother after my divorce. And so I could not be gone traveling, working on documentaries anymore. So that's when the camera really turned inward to my own family. And I started by documenting with just a little point and shoot. I had a point and shoot with me. I carried it all the time. So no more 4x5 camera. And my mother was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and I had to go and clean out her home. And so I started just by trying to document through the process. And this is a picture of my mom. And we had to have an estate sale to clean out her home so I could move her into an assisted living facility. So I just started making photographs partly out of almost like therapy. Like I didn't know what else to do, but to document. But also it was the first time that I was sort of like making images with my own family in it. And sometimes they were metaphorical images. And so I made a blog and I posted images every day. And sometimes I wrote about them. Like this is the self-portrait the last time I was in my family's home when I had to clean it out. And it was my great-grandfather had built that home, and my grandfather grew up there. My mother grew up there. I grew up there. So this was the last time I was in this home. And then when I got back to Colorado, I realized, well, home really is now where I am with my son. And so I made a photograph of him, you know, sort of in the window. So I made self-portraits. I photographed letters that my mother was sending me from the nursing home. Lots of love. God bless you, your mom. I brought back photographs of my mom and her siblings and photographed her with them in the nursing home. And then I just photographed my life, my dog, my son. And someone said, Andrea, when I look at your blog, all I see are pictures of you and your son and your dog. And I said, well, you know what? That's my life right now. And so I just made images every day, just of the domestic, just trying to think about, I needed to photograph. I mean, I needed to make images. And I find that's true with so many artists and photographers that come through the ranch, is you need to make whatever it is and wherever you are. And so since I couldn't work on these long form documentaries anymore, I decided to do it, you know, in my home, raising my son as a single mom, and just photographing me every day. And this was my blog, 40 plus. And I did this for about a little over a year, about 400 days. And I'm just going to keep going through these. This is my mom and my son playing the piano. And you know, of course, I was still thinking about light and color, you know, composition. I was working in a square format. But I really felt like this moved me. This changed my work from, I'm just going to keep moving through these quickly, from looking outwards and telling stories often that mirrored my own, but through other people, to moving to a much more personal, kind of vulnerable place that a lot of photographers, you know, draw source from. And, you know, of course, I'm influenced by so many of the people that I meet, you know, so many artists, so many women who make images, you know, of their family or use their family as source, like Betsy Schneider or Jess Dugan, or obviously like a Sally Mann. Not in the snapshot aesthetic, but this idea of using my own life and my own family, my own son, as source material.
I'm wondering, when you started this process, when it was still in the blogosphere, I said blogosphere.
Yeah.
What were some of the reactions that you?
You know, I think when I first started it, it's so funny because when I first started it, I made a blog, but then I made it private because I didn't see this as real work. I saw this as like, well, this is just this little thing I'm doing on the side. I don't really want to show anyone. And then, you know, I let a few people see it and they said, oh, this is this is what you're doing now. This is your life. You should put it out there and let people see it. And so I got a lot of positive feedback on the images, because they were like, it was a snapshot aesthetic. It was sort of like, it didn't seem serious, but in the continuity of the project is where I think the meaning came, and where the visual storytelling took place, not in the single image, but in the continuity of all of the images. And what it did is it allowed me to move into this next project called Toward Amnesia. And it's a project that I decided to take a much closer look at my mother and my family, and portraits of my mother who has Alzheimer's, and my son and myself. And I started thinking a lot about, I was reading a book at the time called Toward Amnesia, and it's a book about this woman who goes through an incredible loss. And because she's having so much grief, she tries to bring on an amnesia so she can forget the pain. And I was reading about this, and there's this kind of amnesia she tries to bring on by submersing herself in cold water. And so at the time, I was going through a lot of pain. I was going through a divorce and breakup. I was going through my mother, kind of a situation where she was losing her memory, and then I was becoming the keeper of her stories, her memories, as my son would be the keeper of mine at some point. So I started making images of the three of us, and then I started making photographs that were more representative of just where I was, kind of the vulnerability of like these two tangerines kind of pulled together. I started like doing things where I would submerge myself in cold and snow, trying to bring on this amnesia as well, which it doesn't work. But I was trying to like find a way to also escape my grief, my pain, my depression, my just pain. And so then I started to photograph myself as I was lying in the snow or submersing myself in cold lakes. But I also started to photograph what I was connected to, and which was my son. And so I started making portraits of him, and in a more, less snapshot, more considered, more formal kinds of images that were all constructed kinds of photographs, where I was trying to get at like the vulnerability, to kind of get inside myself and get inside those people that I was connected to or intimate with. And this is my son's best friend, Nikolai. So these are the photographs I made during this project. And I had an exhibition at the end of this. And these are large. Most of the work is 40 by 50. So pretty large prints. This is my best friend, Mia. And again, I'm looking at a lot of contemporary photographers who are photographing from their own lives, and portrait photographers. I'm also looking at the people's use of color, like Sig Harvey or people like that, who just have this amazing kind of sensitivity to color and light. I also got a printer. So all of the work is printed by someone, Singer Editions in Boston, who really have a real understanding of the kind of palette, the saturated palette I was looking for. So I finished this project after a couple of years. And what came out of it is that I had all of these images of my son, Bo. And I started this project that I'm still working on 15 years later. And I'll just show that now. And this project is called Fraternal, and it's about my son and his best friend. And the project really started when they were like 5 years old. And it was looking at them and their relationship, but it was also looking at like raise a boy and boyhood. And kind of the androgyny of young children and gender, and thinking about how do we engender our sons as like a single mom. How do I engender him? How does he grow? What is the masculine? What is the feminine? And so and what is the intimacy? How do young people connect? How do I find that light? And so I started making photographs of the two of them, both in constructed kind of portraits where I would set it up, and then other times finding them in what they're doing and making photographs, whether they're, playing with swords or resting together or playing in the garden. But I started just making these kind of portraits where I would work with them. Sometimes I would think about an image that I wanted to make. Sometimes it would just sort of come together after we started photographing. And Nikolai, his best friend, was often mistaken for a girl. He did not have a haircut until he was 10. And so I was interested in that sort of androgyny. And his father, though, is a former Army Ranger. And so it was interesting to me that he had this long, beautiful hair, but he was also often dressed in camouflage and wearing his dad's dog tags. And so I wanted to sort of capture sort of that beauty, that innocence, that just, I read something one time, or Sally Mann, I watched a video interview, and she said that, she photographed her children in part because they're just so beautiful, and we don't stay that beautiful. We don't stay that sort of unblemished. And so I wanted to capture that, and I wanted to capture their connection. They're a year apart. And I wanted to sort of follow it. And then, Nikolai's hair, the braid was cut. And I wanted to photograph. I knew in the beginning that I wanted to follow them until they were 18 and make as many images.
So they had to stay friends.
What?
They had to stay friends.
They had to stay friends, yes. And, you can see as Nikolai gets a bit older, he's like 10 here, he's really starting to take on these sort of like a little bit more of like masculine pose and sort of like his army bag, whereas Beau, I don't know if it's because he's being raised in an art center, he's still like, wearing, pretending he's a knight, a little bit younger and a little bit still more in imaginary playland. And so here's kind of a quintessential image where, Beau is where he wore a kilt for years every day. And then, and Nikolai is becoming more, following his father. And you can see too, as they start to stand more farther apart. And so sometimes I make images of them together, and sometimes I make images of them singularly, whether they're, playing with BB guns and firecrackers, playing at the river. And sometimes it's not easy. I think it's been a little hard on my relationship with my son because he has become less and less interested in being photographed. So sometimes it's sort of like, am I the mom or am I the photographer? Where I'm having him stand out in the snow and he's cold. It's like, oh, just one more. We almost have the image. And he's like, can you not be a photographer? Can you be my mom? So it sometimes has been kind of challenging for us. But we've been doing this for quite a while now.
How often do you photograph them?
Well, I photograph them. Well, Nikolai usually lives with us in the summers, so I make a lot more images in the summer because we live about 4 hours apart. But I would say a couple of times a year, I photograph him. And, sometimes I'm thinking about constructing images that speak to like connection or speak, to like vulnerability, kind of almost like womb-like image here in the golf course. And then sometimes I'm just finding, what he's doing and making a photograph. So these last images are kind of more recent, haven't really shown yet, but this was right at the beginning of COVID. We made this image. This is Bo. And this was during COVID when I made a lot of single images because Bo and I were kind of together. And this is an image I made with him. And it's the first time I sort of put myself in the image. But I've been thinking a lot, as he's getting older. He was 15 here and kind of really individuating and not super wanting to be photographed or even be around me. But I wanted to sort of capture that time of like just that COVID time when we were just really together all the time.
So this is really the first time that you put yourself in the image.
It was the first time. And I've been putting myself in more images. I haven't shown them yet, but I have been doing more photographs with him. He's
I wonder if there's a connection there between placing yourself in the image with him in those moments before he becomes an adult and, transition to another phase in his life, and those earlier images of you and him with your mother. It's really interesting that in the context of what we're seeing here, that was the last time that you were in the image as well.
Yes, that was the last time. And then we actually I don't have it here, but we did just make another image with my mom a couple of months ago, which I'll put together as a triptych as well. But I've seen the project really as Bo and Nikolai, but as he gets older, I feel like it's either the same project or it's a different project of myself with him, and as he's moving away and definitely individuating and just about out. And so this would be the most recent image.
And they're 17 now, you said?
They're 17 and 18. Yes.
Wow.
Almost.
And how does Nikolai feel about the ongoing project? Is he a willing participant? Or
Nikolai is far more willing than Bo and always has been. And maybe it's the relationship of my own child. I would say, I think Nikolai has a better understanding of what I've been trying to do and kind of the breadth of the project. And I think it's the same thing as like the blog project. I think that the strength, there's single images that are strong, but I think it's in the breadth of the whole project and the passage of time where the storytelling really kind of comes in. And Bo, I don't think he's quite there. He's just more annoyed, more annoyed by the process. And then this is another image that we made recently that I was just trying to still sort of trying to find the vulnerability and softness and connection that they do have and share, kind of really like brothers. So I think that might be.
And do you find that you're thinking differently now about your initial question around gender and boyishness? Did you find anything? Did you learn anything that surprised you, or do you think differently about that today?
Well, I think I'm sort of I guess as a someone, a parent who's just trying to raise a son who can be mindful and open to all sides of himself and gender. I think that it's curious to me how we engender our sons in this culture. And I feel that as much as I've tried to engender just a really broad view of gender, there are certain directions or certain tropes of masculinity that I have seen them really kind of attached to as teenagers. But I hope that in their broader view and thinking, they're open to the fluidity of gender.
It'll be curious to see what will happen the next time that you'll document them, and what will happen to this project in 5 years from now, in 10 years from now.
Yeah, and I told them, you know, I had always said, we'll do it till you're 18. And then Nikolai just told me he may want to join the military. And I thought, well, that's the next chapter. So we'll see.
Well, talking about stereotypes of masculine presence. You can drop your questions to Andrea in the Q&A, and we will gladly respond to them. I wanted to ask you, as you were, first of all, I'm so grateful for the way you share your work and your openness about what led you to do this work. And I was curious about the exploration of parenting and how parenting became a part of your photographic practice. It also made me think about your work at the ranch. I was curious, it seems to me like there's a growing discourse or bodies of work around caregiving within photography, around parenting, and that there's a move toward reckoning those roles in our lives as an inseparable part of our work as creatives, our work as organizational leaders, in a way that I'm not sure was as possible in the past. Also because places like the Anderson Ranch and other residency spaces across the country and across the world acknowledge those different roles in our lives in a much more clear way, and in a much more open way as well. I'm curious to hear if you think about that within the scope of your role, and how those roles kind of play into what you do at the ranch.
Well, I mean, I think about that all the time, especially having been a single parent and in a role like this, and trying to be, you know, make work and have a job, have an administratively, you know, heavy job, and then make my own work and be a parent. And one thing that we've thought a lot about at the ranch is how do we support working parents or working artists who are parents, and specifically families. You know, so we are starting in this coming fall a family residency. We have a residency program. We've had one for years, which is a 10-week residency in the fall and a 5-week residency in the spring. And we decided to do a pilot program this coming fall to have a family residency where families can come and be working artists, and we will help support them in the studios and support their children to have an art making experience in the studios at the same time.
I'm getting goosebumps.
Yes. So that's a pilot program. And if you know any artists who have families who are interested, please have them reach out to me, because we're putting it together now. And I think that there are some residency programs that support families, but obviously not a lot. And obviously it's a complicated thing to come and be in the studio. And then if you have your children with you, what are they doing? And so we are going to have a situation where we can actually support them in the afternoons, and have the children have a real rich artistic experience as well as their parents who are working in the studios.
That is phenomenal. And I'm so delighted to hear that you're developing that kind of model. I know from working with artists, that's one of the first questions that I get asked, you know, when I work with artists, if I'm aware of any residencies that are open to families. And I'm so delighted that we'll get to add the Anderson Ranch to the list. This is
and we do that also, like even in the summers, where like for myself, when I've, you know, gone for like a teaching or thing, it's, you know, I would always have to travel with my son, and it was always kind of like, well, how do I, you know, if I'm a visiting artist at, you know, this university, I've got to hire like a babysitter and bring them with me. Or so like for faculty who are teaching in the summer, who have children, if they bring their child, we really try to make sure that we have a workshop that's the same age, you know, as their child, that their child can be in during the day when they're teaching and their child's in a workshop. So we really try to match that up. So we're pretty sensitive to that. And I think were I not a working mother and a single parent, I may not be as sensitive to that. So I think that definitely my own experience plays into that as well.
That is fantastic and such great news. And you're going to get a lot of emails after this. And I'm curious if you can share with us a little bit, what are you working on now in terms of, these projects are happening and they're ongoing. If there are any upcoming projects or exhibitions that you would like to share with us.
Well, I'm still continuing to work on this project with Bo and Nikolai, but I am starting, well, it's not brand new, but I haven't shown it yet, but I'm working on a project in Scotland, and I'm going to Scotland in a couple of weeks, on the Isle of Tiree, which is in the Inner Hebrides, on boy bagpipers. And I've done a project in the past on Eagle Scouts. I'm just interested in boys and who they are and how they identify. And so anyway, it's a kind of a subculture of bagpipers who are on the Isle of Tiree, and I'm doing portraits and interviews with them.
Wow, amazing. We can't wait to have you back to see some of that work, if you'll agree to share it with us.
Yeah, of course, absolutely.
I'm so delighted that we had this opportunity to kind of look at how the fabric, I'm still thinking of the photo album, and I'm still thinking about how that fabric of the photo album continues to emerge in different ways in your work as it progresses and develops. And I could really see how your work outside of the scope of your relationship with the camera and your relationship with the world through the camera also plays such a significant role in your practice. And I'm so delighted that we got to see all of that with you today.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate, this invitation and being able to share my work with you today.
Can't wait to, again, once you're ready, I mean, no pressure, but once you're ready, we would love to come back to see that work from Scotland.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea, and thank you so much, Ritem. And just a reminder, it